In 1860 Georgia, a plantation mistress did the unthinkable. She turned her own husband into property, and the law did nothing to stop her. The Georgia summer of 1860 hung thick and oppressive over Blackwood Hall, the grand plantation house that crowned 3,000 acres of cotton fields in Washington County. Inside the parlor, 23-year-old Constance Blackwood sat rigidly in her late father's chair, her black mourning dress stark against the burgundy velvet upholstery. Her pale fingers gripped the armrests as she studied the man standing before her with an expression that might have been carved from marble. Thomas Whitmore shifted his weight, hat in hand, acutely aware of the peculiarity of his position. At 28, he was handsome in a common sort of way, with sun-bronzed skin and the capable hands of a man who understood physical labor. He had been the plantation's overseer for 2 years, a position of some authority, but nothing that prepared him for this moment. You understand the terms, Mr. Whitmore? Constance's voice was cool, measured, utterly devoid of sentiment. I believe so, Miss Blackwood. He cleared his throat. Though I confess, the arrangement is unusual. Unusual, she repeated, the corner of her mouth twitching in what might have been amusement. That's a diplomatic word for it. She rose from the chair with fluid grace, moving to the window that overlooked the vast expanse of her inheritance. My father's will is quite clear. A woman cannot hold property of this magnitude without a husband. Within 6 months of his death, I must marry, or Blackwood Hall, everything, passes to my cousin Jeremiah in Charleston. Thomas had met Jeremiah Blackwood once. The man was a profligate gambler with a taste for cruelty and bourbon, roughly in that order. The slaves would suffer under his management, Thomas said quietly. Constance turned, and for the first time, something flickered in her gray eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or approval. Among other concerns, yes. My father built this plantation over 30 years. I watched him transform Georgia wilderness into one of the most profitable estates in the county. I will not see it dismantled by a fool. She crossed back to her chair, but did not sit. Instead, she stood behind it, one hand resting on its back, every inch the commander surveying her troops. You are educated, Mr. Whitmore, more than most overseers. You read Latin and keep meticulous records. You are neither a drunkard nor a wastrel. And most importantly, you understand that Blackwood Hall functions because of systematic order, not brutality. Thank you, Miss Blackwood. I am not flattering you. I am listing assets. Her gaze locked onto his. You will marry me in 3 weeks. Judge Pemberton will perform the ceremony with minimal fanfare. In exchange, you will have a home, a position, and a salary of $200 per annum. You will continue to manage the day-to-day operations of the fields as you have done, reporting to me on all significant matters. Thomas felt the weight of what she was proposing, or rather, commanding. And the nature of the marriage itself will be one of business convenience. You will have your own quarters in the East Wing. We will maintain appropriate appearances in public, but in private, you will understand your place. I am not seeking a husband in the traditional sense, Mr. Whitmore. I am seeking a legal instrument to maintain control of my property. The words hung in the air between them. Outside, the sound of field songs drifted through the window, the enslaved workers moving through the cotton rows in the brutal afternoon heat. Thomas thought of his own prospects. He had no family, no inheritance, no means to acquire property of his own in a society that concentrated wealth in fewer and fewer hands. he thought also of the cruelty he had witnessed on neighboring plantations, and how Constance, for all her cold demeanor, had never permitted whippings for minor infractions or the separation of families. "I accept your terms," he said. The marriage took place on a Thursday morning in late July in the front parlor of Blackwood Hall. Judge Pemberton, an old friend of Constance's father, performed the brief ceremony with 5 witnesses present: the elderly housekeeper, Mrs. Harriet, the butler Samuel, and 3 neighboring planters' wives, whose presence served to legitimize the union in the eyes of Washington County society. Constance wore dove gray rather than white, a practical choice given her mourning period. Thomas wore a new suit she had commissioned for him, understanding that her husband must present a respectable appearance, even if he was, in her mind, little more than an employee with an elevated title. When Judge Pemberton pronounced them man and wife, there was no kiss, only a brief handshake. A business transaction concluded. The wedding breakfast that followed was a subdued affair. Mrs. Pemberton, a stout woman with an excessive fondness for gossip, made several attempts to draw out Constance on her feelings. "Such a whirlwind romance!" she exclaimed, her fan working furiously against the heat. "Why, I had no idea you and Mr. Whitmore had formed an attachment." "Life is uncertain, Mrs. Pemberton," Constance replied smoothly. "My father's death reminded me that we must secure our futures while we can." The woman's eyes glittered with curiosity, but even she dared not press further. Constance Blackwood, now Constance Whitmore, had inherited not only her father's property, but his formidable reputation. One did not trifle with the Blackwoods. After the guests departed, Thomas retreated to his new quarters in the East Wing. The rooms were comfortable, far superior to his previous overseer's cottage, but there was no mistaking their distance from the master bedroom. He understood the geography of the house now reflected the geography of their arrangement. That evening, Constance summoned him to her study. "Tomorrow, we begin establishing the patterns that will govern this household," she said without preamble. She sat behind the massive oak desk that had been her father's, a stack of ledgers before her. "You will take breakfast at 7 in the dining room. I take mine at 6:30 in my private sitting room. We will review plantation business together each evening at 8. On Sundays, we will attend church together and accept social calls as expected of a married couple." Thomas nodded, taking the seat across from her only after she gestured to it. "The slaves," she continued, "will be informed that you are master of Blackwood Hall in name, but all significant decisions flow through me. This is not unusual. Many planters' wives manage their households, while their husbands attend to politics or business elsewhere. I will simply be more direct about it." "And what do I tell people who ask about our arrangement?" "You tell them nothing. If pressed, you may say that I have strong opinions about the management of my late father's estate, and that you respect my knowledge of its workings. Any man who would criticize you for that is a fool. Profitable wives are an asset." Over the following weeks, the household settled into its peculiar rhythm. Thomas managed the field workers, making decisions about planting schedules and crop rotation in consultation with Constance. She handled the accounts, correspondence with cotton factors in Savannah, and the complex social obligations that came with their position in county society. To the outside world, they appeared to be a reasonably matched couple. Thomas was deferential to his wife in public, which was proper. Constance showed him courtesy without warmth, which was acceptable. Rumors circulated, of course, they always did, but no one could point to any specific impropriety. It was in the private dynamics of Blackwood Hall that the true nature of their relationship revealed itself. 3 months into the marriage, Thomas made his first serious error in judgment. A slave named Joseph, one of the most skilled carpenters on the plantation, had been promised by Constance's father that he could work Sundays on his own projects, selling furniture he made to save money toward purchasing his family's freedom. Thomas, unaware of this arrangement and under pressure to complete repairs to one of the cotton barns, ordered Joseph to work on a Sunday. Joseph respectfully but firmly refused. Thomas, feeling his authority challenged, raised his voice. The confrontation escalated until Samuel, the butler, intervened and summoned Constance. She arrived at the carpentry shop to find Thomas red-faced and Joseph standing with quiet dignity, waiting for judgment. "Explain," Constance said, the single word cutting through the tension. Thomas outlined the situation, framing it as a matter of disobedience. Joseph remained silent until Constance turned to him. "And your account?" Master Blackwood gave his word, ma'am. "Sunday is my own time. I've saved near $300 these 5 years toward buying freedom for my wife and children. I mean no disrespect, but a man's word should mean something even when he's dead." Constance's expression remained neutral, but Thomas saw something flicker in her eyes. Was it respect? "You are correct, Joseph. My father's word stands. Return to your work." As Joseph departed, she turned to Thomas. "Come with me." In her study, with the door firmly closed, she unleashed her fury with surgical precision. "You undermined a promise made by my father. You challenged the integrity of Blackwood honor over a matter you knew nothing about. And you did so publicly in front of the other slaves, which means they now know you are ignorant of the agreements that govern this plantation." "I was not informed." "Then you should have inquired. You should have asked Samuel or Mrs. Harriet, or come to me. Instead, you assumed authority you do not possess and created a crisis where none existed." Thomas felt his own anger rising. "I am your husband. I meant to have some authority in this house." "You are my husband in name only, by arrangement, as you well know. Your authority extends as far as I permit it, and not 1 inch further." She moved closer, her voice dropping to something more dangerous than shouting. "You will go to Joseph tomorrow and apologize. You will tell him that you were unaware of the arrangement and that it stands. And you will never, ever make a decision regarding promises made to the slaves without consulting me first." "You would have me apologize to a slave?" "I would have you apologize to a man whose trust you violated. The fact that he is enslaved makes your error worse, not better. He has no legal recourse, no ability to appeal to anyone but my sense of honor. And you nearly destroyed that." Thomas stared at her, seeing perhaps for the first time the full measure of the woman he had married. She was not merely cold or controlling. She was operating according to a code he had failed to understand. "You care about them," he said slowly. "Don't romanticize it." She turned back to her desk. "I care about order. I care about productivity. I care about the reputation of Blackwood Hall. A plantation where the master's word is meaningless is a plantation in chaos. My father understood that absolute power requires absolute consistency. You will learn the same, or you will be useless to me." He apologized to Joseph the next day. The man accepted with grace, and in the weeks that followed, Thomas found himself observing Constance more carefully. Winter came to Georgia, such as it was, a softening of the brutal heat, a few cold nights, the cotton harvest completed, and the fields lying fallow. Thomas had been married to Constance for 6 months, and he was beginning to understand the intricate machinery of Blackwood Hall. Constance's management of the enslaved population was unlike anything he had encountered on other plantations. She maintained detailed records of every person, their skills, their family relationships, their health, their temperaments. She ensured adequate food and clothing, not out of sentiment, but because, as she explained to Thomas, malnourished slaves are unproductive slaves, and dead slaves are expensive to replace. She permitted the slaves to maintain garden plots and sell surplus vegetables in town, keeping the money for themselves. She allowed marriages and refused to separate families unless, as she put it, the expense of their collective upkeep exceeds their productive value, which it almost never does. She prohibited whipping except in cases of genuine violence or theft, and even then she reviewed each case personally. Thomas watched her interrogate overseers. He had hired 2 assistants by now, about proposed punishments, dissecting their reasoning until they either justified the punishment beyond doubt or retreated in embarrassment. "They think I'm soft," she said one evening, reviewing a report in her study. Thomas had been summoned to discuss the spring planting. "The other planters, the ones who beat their slaves for looking at them wrong, they think I'm a woman who doesn't understand discipline. And yet Blackwood Hall is more profitable than any of their plantations." "Precisely." She set down the report. "Fear is useful, but it's inefficient. My father taught me that. A slave who fears death or maiming will work to avoid punishment. A slave who has something to preserve, family, small privileges, the hope of eventual manumission, will work to protect those things. It's still slavery, Mr. Whitmore. Don't mistake pragmatism for morality. But it's effective slavery." Thomas found himself increasingly disturbed by these conversations, not because of Constance's coldness, but because of her clarity. She never pretended the system was anything other than what it was. She didn't clothe it in biblical justification or romantic nonsense about benevolent patriarchy. She simply acknowledged that she had inherited a human horror and was managing it for maximum efficiency. "Do you never question it?" he asked one night, emboldened by whiskey and darkness. They were in her study, the hour late, reviewing accounts of the year. "Question slavery?" She looked up from the ledger. "Constantly. Do I have the power to end it? No. Could I free my slaves? Legally, barely. Georgia law makes manumission nearly impossible. Practically, what would they do? Where would they go? The free black population is small, vulnerable, constantly under threat. I could ruin 200 lives in a fit of moral superiority and accomplish nothing. So you do nothing. I do what I can within the system that exists. Joseph will purchase his family's freedom in 3 more years at the rate he's saving. Mary in the kitchen is teaching her daughters to read, and I pretend not to notice because educated slaves are illegal but useful. Samuel's son is learning accounting from me because when I'm dead, I want someone who understands these books to help whoever inherits this place manage it with some sense." She closed the ledger. "You think I should feel guilt? Perhaps I should. But guilt without action is merely self-indulgence, and action without thought is chaos. I choose order." Spring of 1861 brought more than new cotton shoots. It brought war. South Carolina had seceded in December, followed by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. In April, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter, and the nation split in two. Thomas found Constance in her study the morning after news of Fort Sumter reached them, staring at a letter. My cousin Jeremiah has received a commission as a colonel, she said without looking up. He writes to inform me that he expects all able-bodied men in the family to enlist. He is concerned that my husband has not already done so. Thomas felt cold dread settle in his stomach. What will you tell him? That you are exempt due to the 20-slave law, which is true. Plantations with more than 20 slaves are permitted to keep one white man home to prevent uprisings. But Jeremiah will know that's an excuse. He'll know you're staying because I'm keeping you here. Let me go, I can. No, the word was absolute. I will not sacrifice my ability to manage this plantation so that you can die in a ditch in Virginia for a cause that's already lost. You think the Confederacy will lose? I think the Confederacy is an agricultural economy attempting to fight an industrial one. I think they're fighting without significant allies, while the Union has the sympathy of European powers who have abolished slavery. I think this will be a long, brutal war, and at the end of it, everything will change. She finally looked at him. The question is what we do in the meantime. As spring became summer, the war seemed distant, something happening in Virginia and Maryland, not Georgia. But its effects were immediate. The cotton market collapsed as Union blockades cut off exports to Europe. Prices for everything else soared. Young men vanished to military service, leaving plantations understaffed. Thomas found himself working in the fields alongside the slaves more frequently, trying to compensate for lost labor. Constance sold off land, livestock, anything she could to raise cash to keep the plantation functioning. The grand dinners ceased. The household staff was reduced. Even the slaves noticed the tightening belts. It was during this period that the balance between Thomas and Constance began to shift. One evening in July, Thomas returned to the house filthy and exhausted after a day spent repairing an irrigation canal. He found Constance in the kitchen, preparing dinner because the remaining cook was ill. She looked up as he entered, and for the first time since their wedding, he saw vulnerability in her face. She looked tired, more than tired, strained to the breaking point. "Sit down," he said. "I need to sit down." Perhaps it was the tone, or perhaps she was simply too exhausted to argue, but she sat. Thomas took over at the stove, cobbling together a simple meal from what was available. They ate in silence in the kitchen, neither willing to pretend they could maintain the formal dining room ritual in current circumstances. "It's falling apart," Constance said finally. "Everything my father built. 40 years of work, and it's dissolving. The war won't last forever. The war is destroying slavery, whether it lasts forever or not. Every day more slaves escape to Union lines. Every day the Confederacy grows weaker. When the Union wins, and it will win, they'll free every slave in the South. And what then? What is Blackwood Hall without slaves?" Thomas had been thinking about this question himself. It becomes a farm worked by free labor. Free labor that has no reason to stay here. Free labor that has every right to demand wages we can't pay. Free labor that remembers being enslaved. She looked at him directly. "You understand what will happen, don't you? When the slaves are freed, there will be a reckoning. They will remember every cruelty, every indignity. The merciful masters will fare better than the brutal ones, but none of us will be safe." "Is that why you've been kinder than necessary?" "I've never been kind. I've been pragmatic. But yes, I've thought about the day when the people I've enslaved become free citizens with the power to accuse, to testify, to seek justice. I've thought about it for years. By 1862, the war had come to Georgia. Union forces pushed into the state, and Sherman's name became synonymous with destruction. Refugees from other plantations arrived at Blackwood Hall with stories of burning fields and liberated slaves. Constance made a decision that shocked Thomas. She gathered all the enslaved people of Blackwood Hall and offered them a choice. "The Union Army is 30 miles away," she told them in the yard before the big house. "They are liberating slaves as they go. You can leave now with my blessing and whatever money you've saved. You can go to the Union lines and claim your freedom, or you can stay and work for wages. $1 a week, plus room and board. When this war ends, I will sign papers of manumission for anyone who remains. The choice is yours." Half of them left within 2 days. Joseph stayed, bringing his carpentry skills and his fierce intelligence to the question of how to keep the plantation functioning with 1/10 of its former workforce. Mary stayed, and Samuel and 24 others who had family ties or skills they hoped would have value in whatever came next. Thomas watched Constance during this period with growing admiration. She had abandoned the fiction that she could maintain the old order. Instead, she was negotiating for survival in a new one. But some transitions are too abrupt, some changes too destabilizing. In October 1862, Jeremiah Blackwood arrived at Blackwood Hall. He was no longer the gambling fool Thomas had met before. He was Colonel Jeremiah Blackwood now, hardened by war, leading a regiment that had seen action at Shiloh and Stones River. He came with 20 soldiers and a court order. Constance Whitmore, née Blackwood, was to be removed from management of Blackwood Hall on grounds of giving aid and comfort to the enemy by freeing slaves. "You freed slaves," Jeremiah said, without preamble, standing in the parlor in his gray uniform. "You gave them money and sent them to Union lines. That's treason, cousin." "I gave them a choice in anticipation of inevitable emancipation," Constance replied, standing behind her father's desk as if it were a fortress. "I violated no law currently on the books." "You violated Confederate law against assisting enemy forces." "Judge Pemberton signed the order this morning. I assume control of Blackwood Hall immediately." Thomas stepped forward. "The property is in my name now, by marriage." Jeremiah smiled, a predatory expression. "And you're conscripted. Congratulations, cousin-in-law. You're now a private in the Confederate Army. Report to my second lieutenant outside." The trap was perfect. By assuming control of the property, Jeremiah removed the exemption that had kept Thomas at Blackwood Hall, and without Thomas present as legal owner, Constance had no standing to resist. Thomas looked at Constance. For the first time in their marriage, he saw fear in her eyes. "Go," she said quietly. "Survive this. Come back." "Constance." "That's an order, Mr. Whitmore." He left with Jeremiah's regiment the next morning. As he marched away, he looked back to see Constance standing on the porch of Blackwood Hall, as straight and unyielding as the day he'd first agreed to marry her. Thomas survived Chickamauga barely. He survived the siege of Chattanooga. He survived cold and hunger and disease and the specific horror of combat. He received one letter from Constance, smuggled through lines by a civilian trader. "Jeremiah is destroying everything. He's recalled the freed slaves at gunpoint. He's selling off equipment, livestock, everything for Confederate bonds that are worthless. He spends his furloughs here drinking and raging about lost causes. The slaves are terrified. Samuel was whipped for talking back. Mary's daughters were sold south. Joseph is dead, killed trying to escape to Union lines. This is hell, Thomas. If you can, survive. If you can't, I don't blame you. See, by 1864, as Sherman began his march to the sea, Thomas was a sergeant in what remained of a Georgia regiment so decimated that it was folded into other units 3 times. When Sherman's army swept through Washington County in November, Thomas was 50 miles away, unable to protect or even know the fate of Blackwood Hall. He learned later that Jeremiah had been at the plantation when Union forces arrived. He died, leading a foolish charge against overwhelmingly superior numbers. The plantation house was burned. The barns were destroyed. The fields were salted. Thomas heard this from a refugee in South Carolina, where his unit had retreated. He went numb, assuming Constance had died in the conflagration. He was wrong. When Thomas finally returned to what had been Blackwood Hall in April 1865, he found ruins. The grand house was a blackened shell. The outbuildings were gone. The fields lay waste. But in the overseer's cottage, the small building where Thomas had lived before his marriage, which had somehow escaped the burning, he found Constance. She was thinner, her hair streaked with premature gray, wearing a plain dress that had been patched multiple times. She was cooking over a fireplace, and Samuel sat at a small table, both of them looking up in shock as Thomas appeared in the doorway. "You're alive," Constance said, the words half statement, half question. "So are you." They stared at each other across the room, and then Constance did something Thomas had never seen. She smiled. Not a cold, calculated expression, but genuine relief and joy. "We're both remarkably difficult to kill," she said. Over the next weeks, the story emerged. When Sherman's forces had come, Constance had hidden in the slave quarters with Samuel and the others. She had watched Jeremiah die. She had watched Union soldiers liberate the slaves who remained. And when the soldiers moved on, she had emerged to find herself truly free for the first time, free of her cousin, free of the system that had defined her life, free to choose her own future. "The slaves are all gone," she told Thomas as they walked through the ruins. "Some went north with Sherman, others just scattered. I don't blame them. This place represented bondage. Why would they stay? Samuel stayed. Samuel is 70 years old with nowhere else to go. He stays because I'm cooking his meals and we're keeping each other alive." She turned to face Thomas. "The plantation is finished. The house is gone. The land is contaminated. We have nothing. We have each other." She laughed, a bitter sound. "Do we?" "We have a legal marriage entered for convenience. You owe me nothing, Thomas. The debt was paid when you survived the war. And if I want more than a marriage of convenience," Constance studied him, and in her eyes he saw the accumulated weight of 4 years of war, loss, and survival. "What could you possibly want from me? I'm not the same person who married you. I'm not the mistress of a grand plantation. I'm a woman with nothing but debt and burned land." "I want a partner," Thomas said. "I've spent 4 years thinking about what you said, about doing what we can within the systems that exist. The system has changed. Slavery is ended. The plantations are destroyed. Something new is being built, and I want to build it with you, not as an employee or a legal fiction, but as an actual partner. Why? Because in all my life, I've never met anyone as brilliant, as strong, or as fiercely committed to survival as you are. Because you're the only person I know who could look at this," he gestured at the ruins, "and see possibility instead of endings." Constance was quiet for a long moment. Then she held out her hand. "Partners then, equal partners, no more mistress and servant." He took her hand, agreed. It took them 10 years to rebuild. Not Blackwood Hall. That was gone forever. But they built a smaller house on the property, and they converted the land to tenant farming, renting plots to freedmen and poor whites alike. Samuel stayed until his death in 1870, helping manage accounts and serving as a bridge between the white landowners and black farmers who were navigating the dangerous waters of Reconstruction. Thomas and Constance had 2 children, both of whom grew up understanding that the prosperity of their farm depended on fair dealing with tenants, regardless of race. Constance taught them to read by age 4 and manage accounts by age 8. The marriage that had begun as pure transaction became something else. Not a fairy tale romance, but a genuine partnership built on mutual respect, shared struggle, and the understanding that survival requires adaptation. In 1890, when Constance died at age 53, the local newspaper wrote her obituary with careful ambiguity. They noted her management of Blackwood Hall during her father's declining years, glossed over the war years, and celebrated her work with Thomas in establishing successful tenant farms during Reconstruction. They called her a remarkable woman of her time. Thomas kept the newspaper clipping in her Bible. On it, he wrote in the margin, "She was remarkable in any time. She saved me as much as I saved her, and together we built something better than what we inherited." And that, perhaps, was the truth of it. Not that one enslaved the other, or that their beginning defined their ending, but that 2 people found a way to transform a legal fiction into a genuine partnership amid the collapse of an old world and the birth of a new one. The story of Constance and Thomas Whitmore became a cautious legend in Washington County, told quietly, with varying emphasis depending on who was listening. Some saw it as proof that the old plantation system had a room for mercy. Others saw it as evidence that even the powerful are subject to forces beyond their control. Still, others simply saw 2 people who refused to be destroyed by history, even when history did its best to consume them. The truth was probably all of these things, and none of them. History is rarely simple, and the stories of people caught in its currents are complicated by circumstance, choice, and the fundamental mystery of how human beings respond when everything they know is burned to ash. But this much is certain: a woman who once commanded a plantation and enslaved hundreds became a partner to the man who had once been little more than her employee. And in that transformation, both found a kind of freedom that neither had imagined possible in the Georgia summer of 1860, when a desperate arrangement brought them together